Min Jae's fingers trembled as he gripped the crystal whiskey glass. His knuckles bone white against the amber liquid that burned slower than the rage simmering in his chest. The private booth of Seoul's most exclusive restaurant felt like a gilded cage, trapping him in a decision he never made, a date he never wanted, with a woman he'd sworn to never acknowledge. His mother had crossed a line this time, invoking his dead father's memory, weaponizing grief like a blade to his throat, forcing him into this humiliating charade. But what she didn't know, what no one could possibly understand, was that the woman walking through those restaurant doors in exactly 4 minutes would represent everything Min Jae had spent 3 agonizing years learning to hate. She would be black, and in Min Jae's shattered world, that single fact carried the weight of his father's blood, the echo of betrayal, and a darkness so consuming it had hollowed out whatever remained of his humanity. The Rolex on his wrist ticked like a countdown to disaster, each second dragging him closer to a collision he couldn't prevent, with a stranger who had no idea she was about to meet a man who'd already condemned her before learning her name. The restaurant doors swung open. She walked in, and the entire room seemed to inhale simultaneously. Min Jae didn't look up, refused to give her even that small courtesy. His eyes locked on his phone screen displaying security reports he wasn't actually reading. But the shift in energy was unmistakable, conversations pausing mid-sentence, heads turning with that particular soul curiosity reserved for anything beautifully out of place. Footsteps approached his booth, soft but steady, nervous but determined. Min Jae counted to 5, preparing his coldest expression, ready to deliver the calculated cruelty that would end this disaster before it truly began. When he finally raised his eyes, something inside him fractured in a way he hadn't anticipated, couldn't name, didn't want to acknowledge. She was breathtaking. Her skin glowed like polished mahogany under the restaurant's soft lighting, luminous in a way that made everything around her seem washed out and lifeless. Deep brown eyes held a warmth that felt dangerously foreign in Min Jae's ice-cold world, a hopefulness that made his chest constrict with something uncomfortably close to shame. Box braids adorned with delicate gold beads cascaded past her shoulders in an elegant style that somehow felt both regal and approachable. And her dress, God, her dress was a masterpiece that stopped his breath for reasons he refused to examine. Clearly handmade, it was a stunning fusion that shouldn't have worked but somehow did. The structured elegance of a Korean hanbok blended seamlessly with vibrant Nigerian Ankara fabric in golds, deep blues, and sunset oranges. Art you could wear. Culture made visible. A declaration that said, I belong to 2 worlds and I'm not apologizing for either. For one unguarded second, Min Jae forgot to hate. Forgot the script he'd written in his head. Forgot everything except the undeniable fact that this woman was genuinely, devastatingly, impossibly beautiful. And that terrified him more than any rival gang ever could. Because beauty like that was dangerous. Beauty like that made you forget, made you trust, made you vulnerable. And the last time Min Jae had let himself be vulnerable around a beautiful black woman, his father had died screaming in a warehouse stained with gunfire and betrayal. 3 years ago. 3 years since Jasmine, Korean-American, brilliant, and deadly, had sold his family's secrets to rival gangs, orchestrated the ambush that left his father bleeding out while Min Jae screamed for help that came too late. His father's last words still haunted every dream. Don't become like me, Jaeya. Find something real. But how could he find anything real when trust felt like signing a death warrant? The warmth drained from Min Jae's face like water through a sieve, replaced by the familiar ice that had kept him safe, kept him strong, kept him alone. His features hardened into the mask that made enemies tremble and allies walk carefully. By the time she reached his table, by the time her hopeful smile landed on his cold expression, Min Jae had rebuilt every wall, reinforced every defense, and prepared to do what he did best. Destroy something beautiful before it could destroy him first. Hello, she said, her voice carrying a melodic accent that placed her somewhere between Seoul and somewhere far more colorful, her Korean careful but clear. She extended her hand, that heartbreaking smile still in place despite the ice radiating from across the table. "I'm Chinaza. It's very nice to meet you. Thank you for agreeing to this dinner." Her name felt like music Min-jae refused to hear. Her gratitude felt like a knife he wanted to twist. He stared at her outstretched hand for exactly 5 seconds. Long enough for hope to curdle into confusion. Long enough for her smile to falter at the edges. Long enough for the warmth in her eyes to flicker with the first shadows of doubt. Then he gave her the coldest, briefest handshake in the history of human interaction. His skin barely grazing hers before he pulled away as if burned. As if touching her any longer might contaminate him with whatever weakness she represented. "Min-jae," he said flatly in English, his voice carrying all the emotional warmth of a January morgue. And then he looked away, dismissing her completely, returning his attention to his phone as if she'd already ceased to exist. Chinaza stood frozen for a heartbeat, her hand still extended in the space where his had been, confusion blooming across her beautiful face like a bruise. She'd traveled 90 minutes by subway from her cramped student housing in Hongdae to get here. She'd spent her last spare money on fabric for this dress, stayed up 3 nights hand-sewing every stitch because she wanted to honor both her Nigerian heritage and her adopted Korean home. She'd worked a double shift yesterday at the boutique and had class early tomorrow morning, but she'd agreed to this dinner because Mrs. Park, Min-jae's mother, had been so kind to her, had anonymously paid her overdue rent when Chinaza was 2 weeks from eviction, had treated her with a maternal warmth that made being 5,000 miles from her own mother just slightly more bearable. But before we continue with what happened next, with the collision that would shatter both their worlds in ways neither could predict, if you're already hooked by this impossible meeting between a man drowning in hatred and a woman radiating hope, do me a favor. Smash that subscribe button, hit the like icon, and turn on your notification bell so you never miss what happens when prejudice meets beauty, when rage meets grace, when a monster discovers the one person who might see the human underneath. Because what's about to unfold will test everything you think you know about love, redemption, and second chances. Trust me, you don't want to miss a single second. Now back to the moment that changed everything. Slowly, Chinaza lowered her hand and slid into the booth across from him. Her movements careful, deliberate, as if she were approaching something wild and wounded. She smoothed her dress, cleared her throat softly, and tried again, her voice still warm despite the frost radiating from across the table. "Your mother told me you work in business," she said, her Korean accented but clear, each word chosen carefully like stepping stones across dangerous water. "What kind of real estate?" Min-jae interrupted without looking up, his tone so dismissive it felt like a slap. "Nothing that would interest you." The condescension in those 7 words was unmistakable, calculated, designed to wound. Chinaza flinched as if he'd physically struck her, but she gathered herself, straightened her spine, and tried once more because she'd been raised by an Igbo mother who taught her that dignity meant trying even when kindness was met with cruelty. "Actually, I'm very interested in..." Min-jae's phone rang, cutting through her sentence like a blade through silk. He answered immediately without excusing himself, without acknowledging her at all, switching to rapid Korean that excluded her completely from the conversation. His voice was different now, sharp, commanding, dangerous. He was discussing money, territories, veiled threats delivered in the coded language of Seoul's underground, making decisions that affected lives and fortunes, while the woman across from him sat in humiliated silence, feeling smaller with each passing second. 5 minutes crawled by like hours. Chinaza sat with her hands folded in her lap, fighting the burning sensation behind her eyes, thinking of every microaggression she'd endured in Seoul. Strangers touching her hair without permission. The modeling agency that said her skin was too dark for Korean beauty standards. The elderly woman on the subway who'd pulled her grandson away from Chinaza as if her blackness was contagious. But this felt different. This felt personal. This felt like every fear she'd carried about never being enough, never being seen, never belonging anywhere crystallized into one brutal moment of rejection. When Min-jae finally ended the call, he didn't apologize. Didn't explain. Just signaled the server with a casual wave that demonstrated exactly how little this dinner, this woman, this moment meant to him. "We'll order now," he said in Korean to the approaching server. His tone bored, detached. "I have another appointment." They'd been here less than 15 minutes. Something inside Chinaza cracked. She'd been raised to respect elders, to honor social obligations, to give people grace even when they offered none in return. But there was a difference between grace and self-destruction, between kindness and allowing yourself to be erased. Her voice, when it came, was quieter than before but steadier, carrying the weight of a question she already knew the answer to. "Why did you agree to this dinner if you plan to treat me like I'm invisible?" Min-jae finally looked at her directly for the first time since that initial glance when she'd walked in. His eyes were empty, cold, cruel silver hair catching the chandelier light like frost, sharp features carved from marble. Everything about him screaming wealth, power, and absolute indifference to the pain he was causing. "My mother forced me," he said, each word dropping like stones into still water. "I made it clear I didn't want this. I don't have time for distractions." Distractions? Chinaza's voice cracked on the word. Tears she'd been fighting now pressing hot against her eyelids. "Or do you mean someone who looks like me?" The question hung in the air between them like smoke, impossible to ignore, impossible to take back. The tables nearest them had gone quiet, other diners pretending not to listen while catching every word of this beautiful collision. This public dismantling of a woman who'd walked in glowing and was now visibly crumbling. Min-jae's jaw tightened. For a millisecond, so brief Chinaza almost missed it. Something flickered behind his eyes. Guilt maybe. Recognition perhaps. But it vanished as quickly as it appeared, replaced by something harder, meaner, more deliberately cutting. "You're a student working part-time jobs," he said, his voice surgical in its precision, designed to dissect and destroy. "I run an empire worth billions of won. We exist in completely different worlds, and frankly, you wouldn't understand my life even if I bothered to explain it. This," he gestured vaguely between them, "was a mistake from the beginning. My mother means well, but she doesn't understand that some gaps are too wide to bridge." The words landed like physical blows, each one calculated to humiliate, to diminish, to erase. Chinaza felt something inside her shatter. Not her spirit, but her hope that this man might possess even a fraction of the humanity his mother clearly believed existed beneath that frozen exterior. Tears spilled down her cheeks before she could stop them, hot and shameful, and she hated herself for crying, hated him for being the kind of person who could sit there unmoved while watching someone break in front of him. She stood abruptly, her chair scraping against the floor with a sound that made every head in the restaurant turn toward their booth. Her hands trembled as she reached for her small purse, her vision blurred, her chest tight with the kind of pain that came from being seen and simultaneously rendered invisible, from being judged not for who you were but for what you represented to someone else's broken psyche. But before she left, before she gave him the satisfaction of watching her run, Chinaza did something that surprised even herself. She bowed, deeply, lower than necessary. In Korean culture, the depth of a bow communicated respect, but an excessively deep bow from someone clearly wronged communicated something else entirely. It highlighted shame, emphasized the moral failing of the person receiving it, turned deference into an accusation more powerful than any words could achieve. When she rose, her eyes met his for the last time, and her voice, though thick with tears, carried a clarity that cut through his defenses in ways his whiskey never could. "You're right. We do live in different worlds. Mine has kindness in it. I hope whatever pain you're carrying stops destroying you someday. Because right now, it's making you destroy everyone else around you." Then she turned and walked toward the restaurant exit, her posture straight despite the tears streaming down her face, her Ankara-adorned dress catching light with every step, her braids swaying with a dignity that Min-jae found himself unable to look away from even as he desperately wanted to. The restaurant remained silent except for the soft click of her heels against marble. Every patron watching this beautiful woman exit with her head held high despite obvious devastation. And then, as if choreographed, every eye swiveled back to Min-jae with expressions ranging from disgust to pity to confusion about what kind of man could sit there unmoved after causing such visible pain. Min-jae forced himself to look at his phone, to appear unbothered, to maintain the ice-cold facade that had protected him for 3 years. But his hands shook as he lifted his whiskey glass, and the amber liquid trembled like his certainty was trembling. Like something fundamental had shifted in a way he couldn't quite name and didn't want to acknowledge. Through the restaurant's floor-to-ceiling windows, he watched Chinaza push through the doors into the cold Seoul night. She made it exactly 5 steps before her legs seemed to give out, and she collapsed onto a stone bench just outside the entrance, her face buried in her hands, her shoulders shaking with sobs she'd managed to hold back while inside but could no longer contain. Her phone rang. Even through the glass, Min-jae could see her fumbling for it, wiping frantically at her face, composing herself with visible effort before answering. Her mouth moved, forming words he couldn't hear but could somehow feel, and then her face crumpled again, fresh tears spilling, but her voice, he imagined, remained steady, remained reassuring, remained protective of whoever was on the other end of that call. A server approached Min-jae's table hesitantly. "Sir, would you like to order?" "Leave," Min-jae said quietly, the single word carrying enough menace that the server bowed quickly and retreated, spreading the word through the kitchen that the silver-haired man in booth 7 was not to be disturbed under any circumstances. Min-jae sat alone in his expensive booth, surrounded by luxury, power, and the suffocating weight of a choice he'd made that suddenly felt less like protection and more like self-destruction. He'd done exactly what he planned, arrived late, stayed briefly, delivered cold dismissal, ensured there would never be a second meeting. He'd won. He'd protected himself. He'd maintained his walls. So why did victory taste like ashes? Why couldn't he stop seeing her eyes? Those impossibly warm eyes that had looked at him with hope before he'd systematically extinguished every spark of light in them. Why couldn't he stop hearing her last words? "I hope whatever pain you're carrying stops destroying you someday." Through the window, Chinaza ended her phone call, and Min-jae watched her just sit there on that cold bench, staring at nothing, looking utterly lost in a city that had never quite felt like home, in a moment that should have been a simple dinner but had instead become another confirmation that she would always be other, always be judged, always be found wanting through no fault of her own. Min-jae's phone buzzed. A text from his mother. "How is the dinner going? Is she lovely? Are you being kind?" His thumb hovered over the keyboard, a dozen cruel responses forming and dissolving, before he finally typed, "It's over. Don't ask again." He threw cash on the table. Far more than the meal cost, far more than necessary, as if money could somehow purchase absolution for sins that had nothing to do with economics and everything to do with the rot growing where his heart used to be. Then he stood, straightened his suit jacket, and walked toward the exit with the same commanding presence that made people step aside, made servers bow, made rivals think twice before challenging him. But when he pushed through those doors into the night air, when he passed within 3 feet of Chinaza still sitting on that bench with tears drying on her cheeks and exhaustion written across her beautiful face, he didn't stop, didn't apologize, didn't acknowledge her existence beyond a brief, barely perceptible hesitation in his stride that she was too lost in her own misery to notice. His driver opened the Mercedes door, and Min-jae slid into the back seat, into the leather interior that smelled like money and isolation, into the world he'd built where feelings were weaknesses and vulnerability was a death sentence. "Home, sir?" the driver asked. "Yes," Min-jae said, his voice empty, automatic. But as the car pulled away from the curb, as the restaurant lights faded behind them, Min-jae found himself turning to look through the rear window, found himself watching Chinaza's small figure on that bench growing smaller and smaller until Seoul's night swallowed her completely, and something in his chest, something he'd thought died 3 years ago in a warehouse filled with his father's blood, twisted painfully, insistently, refusing to be ignored no matter how much whiskey he planned to pour on it when he got home. The penthouse, when he arrived, was exactly as he'd left it. Immaculate, expensive, and completely lifeless. Floor-to-ceiling windows showcased Seoul's glittering skyline, but the view felt hollow tonight, like looking at a beautiful painting of a city rather than actually living in one. Min-jae poured himself another whiskey, his fourth, fifth, and stood at those windows, staring at nothing, seeing everything. Seeing Chinaza's hand extended in greeting and his deliberate refusal to meet it with anything but contempt. Seeing her smile falter and die like a flower touched by frost. Seeing her tears, those tears he'd caused with surgical precision, with calculated cruelty, with the same ruthless efficiency he applied to destroying business rivals and consolidating power. His phone buzzed again. Not his mother this time, but Tae-hyun, his second-in-command, his childhood friend, the closest thing Min-jae had to family besides Mrs. Park. "Boss, we've got a situation in Itaewon. The Russian crew is pushing back on the new territory lines. Need you to make a call." Min-jae handled it in 3 minutes, delivered threats in a voice so cold it could freeze blood, made promises of consequences so severe that grown men would lose sleep, negotiated from a position of absolute power because that's what he did. That's who he was, that's all he had left. When he hung up, Tae-hyun sent a follow-up text. "How was the dinner mother forced you into?" "As disastrous as expected." Min-jae stared at the message for a long moment before typing. "Handled. Won't be an issue again." But when he set the phone down, when he returned to staring at Seoul's skyline with a glass of whiskey burning his throat, he couldn't shake the feeling that he'd handled something far more significant than a business negotiation tonight. He'd handled a woman with dreams and struggles and a family 5,000 miles away counting on her. He'd handled someone's daughter, someone's hope, someone who'd walked into that restaurant believing, however naively, that people could surprise you, that strangers could be kind, that the world might be gentler than her experiences had taught her to expect. And he'd proven her wrong in the cruelest way possible. The whiskey glass cracked in his grip. Not shattered, just a hairline fracture spreading like veins through crystal, like the fractures spreading through whatever remained of his conscience. Min-jae set it down carefully, his hand coming away wet with whiskey and a thin line of blood from where a shard had cut his palm. He watched the blood well up, dark and real, and thought about his father bleeding out in that warehouse while Min-jae screamed for help that never came fast enough. Thought about Jasmine's beautiful face, her warm laugh, the way she'd called him Appa like family before she'd sold that family for 30 pieces of silver, and a guarantee of protection from the very gangs who'd murdered his father with information she'd provided. And he thought about Chinaza, who looked nothing like Jasmine beyond the melanin in her skin, who came from an entirely different world, who'd done absolutely nothing to deserve his hatred except exist in a body that reminded him of his worst day, his deepest loss, his most profound failure to protect what mattered. 3 years he'd been running from that warehouse. 3 years he'd been building walls, accumulating power, becoming the kind of man his father had begged him not to become. And tonight, he'd just proven that his father's dying wish, find something real, would remain forever unfulfilled because Min-jae had systematically destroyed his own capacity to recognize real when it walked into a restaurant wearing Ankara fabric and hope. His mother called. Min-jae let it ring through to voicemail, unable to face her voice, her disappointment, her questions about a dinner that should have been simple and had instead become another piece of evidence that her son was disappearing into something cold and unreachable. The voicemail notification blinked. Against his better judgment, Min-jae played it. His mother's voice, thick with tears. "Jaya, Mrs. Kim from church just called me. She heard from her daughter who works at that restaurant. She told me what happened, what you did, how you treated that sweet girl. I don't even know who you are anymore. Your father would be so ashamed. I'm ashamed. That beautiful young woman came all the way from Hongdae after working a double shift. She wore a dress she made with her own hands because she wanted to honor both her culture and ours. She was nervous but hopeful, and you destroyed her. For what? Because she reminds you of Jasmine? Because your pain is so precious that everyone else must suffer for it? I raised you better than this. I thought I raised you better than this. A long pause, filled with the sound of his mother crying. And then, you have a choice, Min-jae. You apologize to that girl. Properly, sincerely, face to face, or you've lost me too. I won't watch my son become a monster just because he's too afraid to heal. The voicemail ended. The penthouse fell silent except for the sound of Seoul's traffic 40 floors below and Min-jae's ragged breathing as something inside him, something he'd kept carefully locked away for 3 years, began to crack and crack and crack. Min-jae didn't sleep. He stood at those floor-to-ceiling windows until Seoul's skyline began to pale with approaching dawn, until the whiskey bottle sat empty beside him, until exhaustion made his eyes burn but his mind refused to quiet, refused to stop replaying Chinaza's face in an endless, torturous loop. Her hope transforming into confusion, her confusion hardening into pain, her pain crystallizing into something worse. Disappointment. Not anger, not hatred, just profound disappointment, as if she'd expected better from humanity, and he'd confirmed her lowest assumptions about how the world treated people who looked like her. When his phone buzzed at 6 a.m. with business reports requiring his attention, Min-jae handled them mechanically, his voice steady and cold despite the chaos churning beneath his skin. By 7, Taehyun had called twice about the Itaewon situation escalating, and Min-jae had resolved it with 3 phone calls and 1 thinly veiled threat that left no room for misunderstanding. By 8, he'd showered, dressed in a fresh suit, and looked exactly like the powerful man who commanded Seoul's underground, except for his eyes, which carried shadows that no amount of expensive skincare could hide. His assistant knocked on his home office door. "Sir, your mother is here. She says." "I know what she says," Min-jae interrupted, his voice flat. "Send her in." Mrs. Park entered like a storm in elegant clothing. Her silver-streaked hair pulled back, her expression carrying the kind of fury that only mothers could wield, the kind that bypassed all defenses because it came wrapped in love and therefore hurt infinitely more than any enemy's attack ever could. "Don't," she said before Min-jae could speak. "Don't you dare try to explain or justify what you did last night. I didn't raise a man who treats people like garbage because they remind him of his pain. I didn't sacrifice everything to give you opportunities just to watch you become exactly what your father feared." "Father feared weakness," Min-jae said, his voice controlled, measured. "He feared trust. He feared you becoming him." Mrs. Park's voice cracked like thunder, tears streaming down her face in a way that made Min-jae's chest constrict painfully. He spent his whole life building an empire on fear and violence, and it killed him. His last words weren't about the business or revenge or power. They were about you finding something real, something that mattered beyond money and territories and the endless cycle of hurt we inflict because we're too broken to heal. She moved closer, her hand reaching up to touch Min-jae's face with a gentleness that felt like accusation. "That girl, Chinaza, do you know anything about her? Do you care? She's 22 years old, studying fashion design at Hongik University while working 2 jobs because her family in Nigeria sold their ancestral land to send her here. Their land, Jaya, the ground their ancestors are buried in. She sends 70% of everything she earns back home to pay for her siblings' education. She volunteers every Saturday teaching Korean children about African culture, even though she faces discrimination daily. And she agreed to meet you, a complete stranger, because I showed her kindness once. And in her culture, gratitude isn't just words, it's action." Mrs. Park's fingers trembled against his cheek. "She's extraordinary, and you treated her like she was nothing, like her black skin was a crime she committed by existing." Min-jae pulled away from his mother's touch, moving back to his windows, his fortress, his isolation. "She looked like Jasmine. She looked nothing like Jasmine except for melanin." His mother's voice rose to a pitch Min-jae had never heard, raw and desperate. Jasmine was Korean American. Chinaza is Nigerian. Jasmine spoke perfect English and Korean. Chinaza speaks Igbo and is still learning our language. Jasmine was a liar and a traitor. Chinaza is a young woman trying to survive in a country that treats her like a curiosity at best and a threat at worst. The only thing they share is the color of their skin. And you using that as justification for cruelty makes you no better than every racist who's ever made Chinaza feel like she doesn't belong. The word racist landed like a physical blow. Min Jae had called himself many things over the past 3 years. Monster, cold, ruthless, broken. But hearing his mother say that word, applying it to him with tears streaming down her face, made something inside him crack wider, made the whiskey and sleeplessness and carefully maintained walls suddenly feel insufficient against the truth he'd been running from. "I know what I am," he said quietly, his voice barely above a whisper. "Then change it." Mrs. Park moved to stand beside him at the window, both of them staring at Seoul waking up below. At a city full of people living and loving and hurting and healing in ways Min Jae had forgotten were possible. "You have 2 choices, my son. You find Chinaza, you apologize properly. Not with money or power or any of the tools you use to control your world, but with genuine remorse and humanity, or you lose me. I mean it, Jaya. I will not watch you destroy yourself and innocent people because you're too afraid to acknowledge that Jasmine was one person, one betrayal, one tragedy that you're using to justify a lifetime of hatred." She turned to face him fully, her hands gripping his shoulders with surprising strength. "Your father died asking you to find something real. Maybe that girl crying on a bench last night while lying to her mother that everything was fine. Maybe she's your chance. Maybe she's the universe giving you an opportunity to become someone who deserves the second chance at life you got when that warehouse didn't claim you too. Or maybe she's just a young woman who deserves an apology from the man who made her doubt her worth. Either way, you owe her this." Mrs. Park released him, stepping back with the exhausted posture of someone who'd fought a battle she wasn't sure she could win. "I'm leaving now. When I see you next, you'll either be my son again, or you'll be a stranger who shares my blood but nothing else that matters." She walked to the door, paused with her hand on the handle, and delivered her final blow without turning around. "Find out everything about her, Min Jae. Not to manipulate or control but to understand. Learn who Chinaza really is. Then decide if you can live with what you did to her. I already know I can't." The door closed with a soft click that felt louder than any slam could have been. Min Jae stood alone in his office, surrounded by expensive furniture and emptiness. And for the first time in 3 years, he let himself feel something beyond rage and grief. He let himself feel shame. Deep, burning, inescapable shame that no amount of power or wealth could purchase away, that no business victory could erase, that no whiskey could drown. He picked up his phone, dialed a number he rarely used, his private investigator, a man who could find information on anyone, anywhere, for the right price. "I need everything on someone," Min Jae said when the man answered. "Chinaza Okafor, Nigerian student at Hongik University. I need her class schedule, her work schedule, her background, her family situation. Everything. But quietly. She doesn't know I'm looking, and I want it to stay that way. How deep do you want me to go, boss?" Min Jae closed his eyes, seeing Chinaza's face again. Her hope, her pain, her dignity even in devastation. Deep enough that I understand who she really is. Not what she represents to me, but who she actually is when nobody's projecting their trauma onto her existence. "Give me 48 hours. The investigator was efficient. 24 hours later, a thick folder arrived at Min Jae's penthouse by secure courier, and what he found inside made the shame in his chest expand into something closer to self-loathing. Chinaza Okafor, 22 years old, from Owerri in Imo State, Nigeria. Scholarship student at Hongik University's fashion design program, ranked 3rd in her class of 120 students despite working 25 hours weekly at a Gangnam boutique and another 15 hours on weekends selling handmade accessories at Hongdae markets. Monthly income, approximately 1.2 million won. Monthly expenses sent home to Nigeria, 850,000 won. Supporting her parents and 3 younger siblings, 2 brothers and a sister, all still in school. Rent for her tiny Gashawon, 400,000 won monthly, recently 2 weeks overdue before an anonymous payment cleared the debt. Min Jae's mother. Of course. He kept reading, each detail another indictment. Chinaza volunteered every Saturday at a community center in Itaewon, teaching Korean children about Nigerian culture, music, and art. She'd faced discrimination at 3 modeling agencies who told her she was beautiful but not Korean beautiful, that her skin tone wouldn't photograph well for Korean markets, that perhaps she should try international modeling instead. She'd been denied 2 part-time positions despite qualifications, with managers offering vague excuses that barely masked their discomfort with hiring a black employee in customer-facing roles. Her professors' evaluations painted a picture of extraordinary talent, innovative, technically brilliant, possesses unique cultural perspective that enriches our program, resilient despite facing challenges many students never encounter. One professor had written, Chinaza represents the future of Korean fashion, the ability to honor tradition while embracing global influences. Her work isn't fusion, it's conversation between cultures, and it's breathtaking. There were photographs. Chinaza laughing with friends at Hongdae cafes. Her smile so genuine it made Min Jae's chest ache. Chinaza working late in the university studio, surrounded by fabric and sketches, exhaustion and determination written across her face. Chinaza at the community center with Korean children clustered around her, their faces bright with curiosity as she demonstrated traditional Nigerian dance moves, her joy infectious even through still images. And there was a video security footage from the restaurant time-stamped from last night. Min Jae almost didn't watch it, but some masochistic impulse made him press play. There he was, cold and dismissive, barely looking at Chinaza as she tried desperately to make conversation. There she was, hope dying in real time across her expressive face, trying 3 times, 4 times, 5 times to bridge the gap before finally asking the question that had haunted Min Jae since it left her lips. Why did you agree to this dinner if you planned to treat me like I'm invisible? And there was his response, cruel and calculated. We exist in completely different worlds, and frankly, you wouldn't understand my life even if I bothered to explain it. Watching himself deliver those words, seeing Chinaza's face crumble, witnessing her tears and her dignity and her devastating final statement. I hope whatever pain you're carrying stops destroying you someday. Min Jae felt something inside him break completely, shatter beyond the careful cracks his mother had initiated, beyond the whiskey-soaked guilt of a sleepless night. This was who he'd become. This was the monster his father had begged him not to turn into. Min Jae watched that video 7 times, each viewing carving deeper wounds into whatever remained of his humanity, until he couldn't distinguish between the shame burning in his chest and the whiskey burning in his throat. On the 8th viewing, he noticed something he'd missed before. The exact moment Chinaza's phone had rung while she sat on that bench outside, how she'd wiped her tears frantically before answering, how her entire demeanor had shifted from devastation to forced cheerfulness in the space of a single breath. The investigators' report included a detail that made that moment even more gutting. The call had been from her mother in Nigeria, their weekly video chat that Chinaza never missed no matter how exhausted or heartbroken or overwhelmed she felt. She'd lied to protect her mother from worry, had smiled through tears and said everything was fine while her world crumbled around her. Because that's what love looked like when you carried your family's dreams on shoulders too young and too far from home. The report also revealed Chinaza's upcoming senior thesis presentation, a fashion show scheduled for 3 days from now at Hongik University's main auditorium, showcasing her collection titled Unity, When Two Worlds Embrace. The collection blended traditional Korean hanbok construction with Nigerian textile techniques, featuring fabrics she'd sourced from both Seoul markets and her family contacts in Lagos. It represented 2 years of work, countless sleepless nights, and every penny she hadn't sent home invested in materials and production. Min-jae closed the folder, his decision crystallizing into something that felt less like choice and more like inevitability. He would go to that show. Not to intimidate or control or manipulate, not with bodyguards or power plays or any of the tools he typically used to bend the world to his will. He would go as a regular person, stand in the back like any other attendee, and see Chinaza's world, her dreams, her truth without the filter of his trauma, distorting everything into threats and betrayals. Maybe then he could find words for an apology that might actually mean something. 3 days felt like 3 years. Min-jae handled his business obligations mechanically, resolved a territorial dispute with a rival gang, finalized a legitimate real estate acquisition in Gangnam, attended 2 meetings where his presence alone was enough to ensure compliance. But his mind stayed elsewhere, stayed with a young woman he'd wounded without cause, stayed with questions that had no easy answers about who he'd become and whether transformation was even possible for someone so thoroughly broken. Taehyun noticed the distraction. "Boss, you've been off since that dinner. What happened?" "Nothing that concerns the business," Min-jae said, his tone making it clear the conversation was over. But Taehyun had known him since childhood, could read the shadows behind his eyes better than anyone except Mrs. Park. "The girl got to you. It wasn't a question." Min-jae didn't bother denying it. "I destroyed her for no reason except my own cowardice. My mother was right. My father would be ashamed." "Your father would understand," Taehyun said carefully. "After what Jasmine did." "Don't." Min-jae's voice cut like a blade. "Don't use Jasmine to justify what I did. Chinaza isn't Jasmine. She's not Korean American, not a liar, not a betrayer. She's just a young woman trying to survive in a country that already makes her feel unwelcome. And I confirmed every fear she's ever had about how people see her. That's not trauma. That's just cruelty." Taehyun studied him for a long moment. "What are you going to do?" "Something I should have done 3 years ago," Min-jae said quietly. "Try to be better than my worst impulses." The day of the fashion show arrived with Seoul's typical autumn crispness. Clear skies, golden light, the kind of weather that made the city feel almost hopeful. Min-jae dressed carefully, choosing an understated suit without the designer labels that usually announced his wealth and status. No bodyguards, no driver. He took the subway to Hongik University like a normal person, standing among students and workers, invisible in a way he hadn't been since inheriting his father's empire. The auditorium was already packed when he arrived, students and faculty filling seats with an excited buzz of conversation. Min-jae slipped into the back row, standing against the wall where shadows could hide him, where he could observe without being observed, witness without interfering. The lights dimmed. Music began. A stunning blend of traditional Korean gaegeum strings and Nigerian talking drums that shouldn't have worked together, but somehow created something entirely new, entirely beautiful. The audience fell silent in anticipation. Then the first model walked, and the entire room seemed to inhale simultaneously. The garment was extraordinary. A hanbok-structured dress using Nigerian attire-dyed fabric in deep indigo and white geometric patterns. The traditional Korean silhouette somehow enhanced rather than diminished by the African textile, creating a visual conversation between cultures that spoke of respect, understanding, and genuine artistic vision. Each piece that followed built on this foundation. Geoghery tops paired with ankara print skirts, wedding garments that blended Korean bajagi wrapping techniques with Nigerian asook weaving, modern interpretations of traditional dress that honored both heritages without diminishing either. Min-jae found himself holding his breath, unable to look away, recognizing the dress Chinaza had worn to their disastrous dinner among the collection and understanding for the first time the significance of that choice. She'd worn her heart on her body that night, had presented herself as a bridge between worlds, had offered him a glimpse of her dreams made tangible. And he dismissed it all without a second glance, too consumed by his own demons to see the extraordinary woman standing in front of him. The show concluded to thunderous applause. Chinaza emerged from backstage looking exhausted and radiant, her braids styled differently now, pulled back to reveal her face fully, gold beads catching stage lights, her smile genuine despite obvious nervousness. She'd done it. Against every obstacle, every microaggression, every person who'd told her she didn't belong, she'd created something undeniably brilliant. And right now, watching her take her bow while the audience rose to their feet in appreciation, if you're feeling even a fraction of the emotion coursing through this moment, if you're invested in whether Min-jae can possibly redeem himself, whether Chinaza will ever trust again, whether two broken people from different worlds can find healing together, then do me a favor. Hit that subscribe button, smash the like icon, because what happens next will determine whether love can truly conquer prejudice, whether redemption is real or just a beautiful lie we tell ourselves. Don't miss a single second of this transformation. Now back to the moment that changes everything. The applause continued, washing over Chinaza in waves of validation she desperately needed, confirmation that her vision mattered, that her voice belonged in Korean fashion conversations, that being different could be a strength rather than a liability. Tears streamed down her face. Happy tears this time, healing tears, the kind that washed away some of the pain Min-jae had inflicted 3 nights ago. Then the Q&A session began, and everything shifted. A middle-aged man in the third row stood, a known fashion critic whose reviews could make or break emerging designers in Seoul's competitive industry. His expression carried the particular condescension that people often wielded when disguising prejudice as intellectual discourse. While the technical execution is competent, he began, his voice carrying to every corner of the auditorium, one must question whether African aesthetics truly belong in Korean fashion. Our traditional garments carry centuries of pure cultural history. Hanbok represents our heritage, our identity. This mixing, he gestured dismissively toward the displayed garments, feels less like innovation and more like dilution. Are we so eager to abandon our roots that we'll blend them with anything foreign and call it progress? The room went silent, uncomfortable silent, the kind of silence that preceded either confrontation or cowardly retreat. Chinaza's face, so joyful moments before, transformed into something harder, more guarded, preparing for a battle she'd fought too many times already. Min-jae watched her shoulders straighten, watched her gather herself to defend her work against thinly veiled racism masquerading as cultural preservation, watched her prepare to stand alone against an established voice in an industry that had already shown her how unwelcome black perspectives were in Korean creative spaces. And something inside Min-jae, something that had been cracking and breaking and reforming over the past 3 days, finally shattered completely, rearranging itself into something that felt less like the monster he'd become and more like the man his father had begged him to be. Before Chinaza could respond, before anyone else could speak, Min-jae's voice cut through the silence from the back of the auditorium, clear and strong and carrying the authority of someone accustomed to being heard. You're wrong. Every head turned. Min-jae stepped out of the shadows, moving down the aisle with the same commanding presence that made rivals nervous and allies confident, but this time wielding that power for something other than intimidation or control. This time using it to defend rather than destroy. Korean culture, he continued, his voice steady and precise, has never been pure. Hanbok itself incorporated Mongolian influences during the Goryeo dynasty. The Jeoggery structure, the way we wrap and tie our traditional dress, all influenced by cultural exchange with northern tribes. Our language borrowed extensively from Chinese characters, later from Japanese during occupation, and now includes countless English words. The very chili peppers that define Korean cuisine, the foundation of kimchi, of gochujang, of the flavors we claim as uniquely ours, came from the Americas through Portuguese traders. Cultural purity is a myth we tell ourselves when we're too afraid to acknowledge that everything we treasure was born from exchange, adaptation, evolution. He reached the front of the auditorium now, standing beside Chinaza's display, his hand gesturing to the garments with genuine appreciation rather than dismissal. These designs don't dilute Korean culture. They prove our traditions are strong enough, beautiful enough, meaningful enough to engage in conversation with other cultures and create something new without losing what makes them valuable. This, he touched the fabric of a hanbok-structured dress in Nigerian attire, isn't abandoning our roots. It's demonstrating that our roots run deep enough to support growth, change, collaboration. Min-jae turned to face Chinaza directly for the first time since walking in, and their eyes met across the space of the auditorium, her expression shocked, confused, wary, his carrying something she'd never seen before, genuine respect, profound regret, and the beginning of understanding. "This collection is brilliant," he said, speaking to her but projecting his voice to fill the room. "The designer is extraordinary, technically skilled, culturally informed, artistically brave enough to take risks that others avoid. Anyone who can't see that isn't protecting Korean culture. They're protecting their own prejudices." The auditorium erupted in applause, louder than before, charged with a different energy now, students and faculty rising to their feet not just for Chinaza's work but for the stranger who'd articulated what many had felt but few had dared to voice. The critic sat down heavily, his face flushed with humiliation, his question answered so thoroughly that any rebuttal would only deepen his embarrassment. But Chinaza barely noticed the applause. Her eyes remained locked on Min-jae, recognition dawning across her face like sunrise breaking through storm clouds. Recognition not just of his identity but of the significance of what he'd just done. The public defense from a man who'd publicly destroyed her 3 nights ago. The cognitive dissonance of hearing validation from lips that had spoken such devastating cruelty. Min-jae held her gaze for 3 heartbeats, then bowed. Deeply, respectfully. The kind of bow that communicated profound apology in Korean culture, and turned to leave before she could respond. Before the moment could transform into confrontation or demand explanations he wasn't ready to articulate in front of hundreds of witnesses. He made it halfway up the aisle before her voice stopped him, carrying clearly despite its softness. "Wait." Min-jae froze, every instinct screaming to keep walking, to maintain distance, to protect himself from the rejection he absolutely deserved. But he'd come here to be better, to try healing what he'd broken, and running now would make his defense meaningless, performative, just another manipulation rather than genuine attempt at redemption. He turned back slowly. Chinaza had stepped down from the stage, moving toward him with cautious steps, her expression unreadable. Not angry exactly, not forgiving either. Something more complex that Min-jae couldn't quite parse. "Why?" she asked simply when she reached him, her voice low enough that only he could hear beneath the auditorium's ambient noise. "Why defend my work after what you said to me? After how you treated me?" Min-jae's throat felt tight, words he'd rehearsed for 3 days suddenly inadequate in the face of her direct question. Her unflinching gaze that demanded truth rather than pretty lies or convenient explanations. "Because you deserved better than what I gave you that night. Because your work is genuinely extraordinary. Because I was wrong. About you, about everything. And I needed to say so publicly since I wounded you publicly." "That's not an answer," Chinaza said, her eyes searching his face for something he wasn't sure he could provide. "That's just more words. You're good with words. You used them like weapons 3 nights ago." She was right. Min-jae took a shaky breath, aware that students were watching this exchange with undisguised curiosity, that whispers were spreading through the auditorium about the silver-haired stranger confronting the designer, that this moment was becoming spectacle whether he wanted it to or not. "Can we talk?" he asked quietly. "Not here. Somewhere private. I owe you an explanation that's real, not performed for an audience." Chinaza studied him for a long moment, suspicion and curiosity warring across her expressive face. Finally, she nodded once, sharp and decisive. "There's a cafe near campus. 20 minutes. If you're not there, I'll know everything you just said was manipulation, and I'll never waste another thought on you." She turned and walked back toward the stage before Min-jae could respond, leaving him standing in the aisle with his heart hammering against his ribs, and the terrifying realization that the next 20 minutes would determine whether redemption was possible or whether he destroyed something precious beyond repair. The cafe was small, tucked between university buildings, the kind of place students gathered for cheap coffee and marathon study sessions. Min-jae arrived first, choosing a corner table far from windows and other patrons, ordering 2 Americanos because he didn't know what else to do with his hands, with the nervous energy flooding his system in ways business negotiations never triggered. Chinaza arrived exactly 20 minutes later, still wearing the elegant outfit from her show, a modern hanbok in cream and gold that made her dark skin luminous, her braids now loose around her shoulders. She slid into the seat across from him with guarded body language, arms crossed, expression neutral but eyes sharp, assessing, looking for deception before he even opened his mouth. "Talk," she said simply. So Min-jae talked. He told her everything. His father's murder 3 years ago, the warehouse stained with blood and betrayal, holding his dying father who whispered final words about finding something real. He told her about Jasmine, about the childhood friendship and trust, about how she'd been Korean American and black and beautiful and deadly, how she'd sold family secrets to rival gangs for money and protection, how the information she'd leaked had orchestrated the ambush that killed his father, while Min-jae screamed for help that came too late. After he died, Min-jae continued, his voice rough with emotion he'd kept locked away for 3 years. I needed someone to blame. The rival gangs, yes. Jasmine, obviously. But my grief was so massive it needed a bigger target. Something I could hate without complications. So my broken brain decided that black women, all black women, carried Jasmine's betrayal in their DNA. I know it's irrational. I know it's racist. I know it's unforgivable. But pain doesn't follow logic, and trauma doesn't care about fairness. Chinaza's expression remained neutral, but her eyes glistened with unshed tears. Not for him, Min-jae understood, but for the universality of grief weaponized into hatred. For how many people throughout history had turned their pain into prejudice and called it justified. When I saw you walk into that restaurant, Min-jae forced himself to continue. You were so beautiful it took my breath away. For 1 second I forgot to hate. I forgot my script. I just saw you. This radiant woman who'd clearly put enormous care into her appearance, who was nervous but hopeful, who represented possibility rather than threat. And that terrified me more than any business rival ever could. Because beauty like that, hope like that, it makes you forget, makes you trust, makes you vulnerable. And the last time I was vulnerable around a beautiful black woman, my father died. He paused, fighting for composure, for words adequate to the magnitude of his failure. So I panicked. I rebuilt my walls in real time and hurt you deliberately, systematically, with surgical precision designed to make sure you'd never try reaching me again. I treated you like you were nothing because I needed you to be nothing, needed to prove to myself that you were just another threat, another potential betrayal, another reason to stay frozen and safe and alone. Chinaza's tears spilled over now, tracking down her cheeks in silent rivers that made Min-jae's chest ache. Do you have any idea? She said, her voice trembling but steady. How many times people have made me feel worthless because of my skin? How many auditions I've lost? How many jobs I've been denied? How many strangers have touched my hair without asking or pulled their children away from me on the subway like my blackness is contagious? I came to Korea chasing dreams my family sacrificed everything for. They sold land our ancestors are buried in to send me here. And every single day, I have to prove I deserve to exist in spaces that make it clear I'm unwelcome. She leaned forward, her eyes burning into his with intensity that made Min-jae unable to look away. That night at the restaurant, I didn't need you to love me or even like me. I just needed you to see me as human, as Chinaza, not as a representative of every black woman who's ever existed, not as Jasmine's ghost, not as your trauma made visible, just as me. A 22-year-old woman far from home, working herself to exhaustion, trying desperately not to fail the people who gave up everything so I could chase something they'll never experience themselves. I know. Min-jae whispered, his own tears falling now, hot and shameful. I see you now, Chinaza. I see exactly who you are. And I'm so deeply sorry for projecting my pain onto someone who'd done absolutely nothing to deserve it. You're not Jasmine. You're not Korean American. You're not a liar or a betrayer. You're Chinaza Okafor from Owerri, Nigeria. You're a brilliant designer, a devoted daughter and sister, a kind person who teaches children and works 2 jobs and creates beauty that bridges cultures. You deserved so much better than what I gave you. Chinaza wiped her tears roughly, her expression hardening. Your apology doesn't erase what you did. It doesn't fix the fact that I cried myself to sleep that night, or that I lied to my mother on the phone because I couldn't bear her knowing that someone made me feel worthless again. Words are cheap, Min-jae, especially from someone who used them like weapons. I know, he said again, feeling the truth of her words like physical blows. I'm not asking for forgiveness. I'm just asking for a chance to prove I can be better than my worst impulses. Not through money or power or any of the tools I usually use to control outcomes, but through genuine change, through learning who you really are, through becoming someone who deserves to exist in the same world as someone as extraordinary as you. Chinaza shook her head slowly, fresh tears falling. I don't know if I can trust that. I don't know if I can risk believing you're sincere only to have you destroy me again when something triggers your trauma. I've been hurt too many times to be naive about people's capacity for change. Then don't trust me, Min-jae said, his voice raw with desperation and honesty. Test me. Give me impossible tasks. Watch me fail and learn and try again. I'm not asking you to hand me forgiveness or trust. I'm asking you to let me earn it. Slowly, painfully, with proof rather than promises. If I fail, you walk away knowing you gave me more than I deserved. If I somehow succeed, maybe we both discover that transformation is possible even for people as broken as me. The cafe hummed around them. Students laughing, espresso machines hissing, life continuing in blissful ignorance of this quiet conversation that felt like the pivot point between Min-jae's past and whatever future might be possible if Chinaza granted him grace he hadn't earned and didn't deserve. Finally, after a silence that felt eternal, Chinaza spoke. I accept your apology, but I don't forgive you yet. Forgiveness isn't a gift I hand you because you asked nicely and cried pretty tears. It's something you earn through sustained action, through proving your words translate into genuine change, through becoming someone who sees my humanity without needing a crisis to remember I possess it. Relief and terror flooded Min-jae in equal measure. What can I do? How do I earn it? Chinaza stood, gathering her bag, preparing to leave. Learn about me, about where I come from, about Igbo culture, Nigerian history, what it means to be black in Korea. Read our literature. Watch our films. Understand why your words cut so deep. If you want my forgiveness, start by educating yourself about the humanity you dismissed so easily. She moved toward the cafe exit, then paused, looking back at him with an expression that carried both pain and possibility. And Min-jae, stop using your trauma as permission to wound others. Your father's death was a tragedy. What you did to me was a choice. Own the difference. Then she was gone, leaving Min-jae alone with cold Americanos and the monumental task of becoming someone worthy of the second chance she'd offered. A chance he swore to himself, to his father's memory, to whatever redemption might look like, that he wouldn't waste. Min-jae started that very night. Not with grand gestures or expensive gifts, the tools he'd relied on his entire life to solve problems and bend situations to his will, but with something far more uncomfortable. Genuine effort to understand a world he'd never bothered examining before. He ordered books online with overnight delivery, Chinua Achebe's Things Fall Apart, Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie's Americana, and Half of a Yellow Sun, Buchi Emikita's The Joys of Motherhood. He found Igbo language learning apps and stumbled through basic phrases with pronunciation so terrible it would have been comedic if the stakes weren't so devastatingly high. He watched Nollywood films late into the night, absorbing storytelling styles and cultural references that felt completely foreign yet somehow deeply human in their exploration of family, loyalty, sacrifice, love. He researched Igbo traditions, the importance of community over individualism, the reverence for ancestors and elders, the intricate social protocols around respect and reciprocity that made Chinaza's agreement to that disastrous dinner even more significant. She'd agreed out of gratitude to his mother, honoring a debt of kindness according to cultural values that prized such obligations. And he'd repaid that grace with cruelty calculated to wound. The shame sat heavier with each new piece of understanding. Days became weeks. Min-jae managed his business obligations with his usual efficiency, but his nights belonged to education, to transformation, to slowly dismantling the prejudices he'd built like fortresses around his grief. He found online communities of Koreans learning about African cultures, discovered Korean-African cultural exchange programs he'd never known existed, read articles about the experiences of Black people in Korea that made his chest tight with recognition of patterns he'd perpetuated without conscious thought. He never contacted Chinaza directly during this time, respecting the boundary she'd established, proving through absence that he understood this wasn't about manipulating her into forgiveness but about genuine internal change whether she ever witnessed it or not. But he thought about her constantly, wondered if she was sleeping better, if her fashion show success had opened doors she'd been knocking on for years, if she still carried the wounds he'd inflicted, or if they'd started healing in his absence. 6 weeks after the cafe conversation, Min-jae's Igbo language tutor, a Nigerian graduate student studying at Seoul National University, mentioned that one of his friends knew Chinaza, that she'd been nominated for a prestigious fashion award recognizing emerging designers who brought fresh perspectives to Korean fashion. The award ceremony was in 3 days. Min-jae made a decision that felt both terrifying and inevitable. He would go, not to the ceremony itself where his presence might make Chinaza uncomfortable, but to the reception area beforehand. He would deliver a gift he'd been working on for weeks, something that demonstrated understanding rather than wealth, effort rather than power. The gift was simple. A hand-woven Nigerian aso-oak fabric in deep indigo and gold. Sourced directly from weavers in Lagos through contacts his investigator had painstakingly established. But what made it meaningful was the accompanying letter, written in careful, still clumsy Igbo with Korean translation below, explaining the fabric's origin, the artisan's stories, and a genuine apology that took Min-jae 17 drafts to express adequately. The letter's final paragraph, translated from his halting Igbo, read, "Chinaza, you told me to learn about your world, to understand why my words cut so deeply. I've spent 6 weeks reading, watching, listening, learning, not to earn your forgiveness which I may never deserve, but because you were right. I dismissed an entire culture, an entire people's humanity, because my pain needed a target bigger than one person's betrayal. I'm learning that Nigerian culture, Igbo culture specifically, values community, respects sacrifice, honors the obligations of gratitude and kinship in ways that make my individualistic cruelty even more unforgivable. You came to that dinner honoring my mother's kindness according to values I've only begun to understand. I repaid that honor with violence disguised as indifference. I'm sorry. I'm learning. I'm trying to become someone who deserves to exist in the same world as someone as extraordinary as you. Whether you ever forgive me or not, thank you for demanding I be better. Thank you for seeing me clearly enough to know I could be." Min-jae arrived at the award venue 2 hours early, left the package with Chinaza's name at the reception desk, and turned to leave before courage could abandon him. But a familiar voice stopped him cold. "Min-jae." He turned slowly. Chinaza stood 10 feet away, having arrived early herself, wearing a stunning dress she'd clearly designed. A modern interpretation of both Korean and Nigerian formal, where that somehow captured elegance from both traditions without diminishing either. She looked breathtaking, successful, more confident than the nervous woman who'd walked into that restaurant 2 months ago. "I didn't expect to see you here," she said carefully, her tone neutral but not hostile, curious rather than defensive. "I was just leaving," Min-jae said quickly. I didn't come to make you uncomfortable. I just wanted to drop off. The fabric and letter? Chinaza interrupted, a small smile playing at the corners of her mouth. The receptionist called me. She said a nervous man with silver hair left something and insisted I receive it before the ceremony. Min-jae's face heated with embarrassment. I should go. This is your night. You shouldn't have to deal with. Stop, Chinaza said, moving closer, her eyes searching his face with that same intense directness that had characterized their cafe conversation. Stop assuming you know what I need or don't need. Stop making decisions for me. She was right. Again. Min-jae fell silent, waiting, letting her control this moment because control was the one thing he'd stolen from her 2 months ago and hadn't yet learned to consistently return. I heard about what you've been doing, Chinaza said softly. Seoul's Nigerian community is small. Word spreads when a powerful Korean man starts attending Igbo language classes, buying our literature, asking genuine questions about our culture instead of treating us like curiosities or threats. People talk, Min-jae, and they've been talking about you. Min-jae's heart hammered against his ribs. I wasn't doing it for recognition. I was doing it because you were right. I needed to understand what I'd dismissed. I know, Chinaza said, and something in her expression softened fractionally. That's why it matters. You didn't announce it publicly, didn't use it to manipulate me into forgiveness. You just did the work, quietly, consistently, for weeks. She stepped closer still, close enough that Min-jae could smell her perfume. Something warm and slightly spicy that made his chest ache with longing for proximity he hadn't earned. My Igbo professor mentioned you're in her beginner class. She said you're terrible at pronunciation but you show up early, stay late, ask thoughtful questions. She said you're learning like someone whose life depends on it. It does, Min-jae said quietly, the truth escaping before he could filter it. Not my biological life, but any life worth living. You made me realize I'd been existing as a ghost haunting my father's empire, letting grief poison everything I touched. Learning about your culture, your world. It's been learning how to be human again. Chinaza's eyes glistened with tears she didn't try to hide. You hurt me so deeply, Min-jae. Made me doubt myself in ways that took weeks to recover from. I'm not sure I can ever fully forget that pain. I don't expect you to forget, Min-jae said, his own voice thick with emotion. I just hope that someday maybe the good memories can outnumber the bad. That I can prove through sustained action that the man who wounded you was the worst version of someone capable of being better. You're already proving it, Chinaza whispered. That's what terrifies me, because I'm starting to believe you're sincere. And believing in people who've hurt you is the scariest thing in the world. The reception area buzzed around them. Other nominees arriving, photographers setting up, the machinery of a prestigious event unfolding. But Min-jae could only see Chinaza, could only hear her words that felt like absolution he hadn't dared hope for. I'm falling for you, he admitted, the words tumbling out raw and unfiltered. I know I have no right to these feelings after what I did. I know it's completely inappropriate and selfish and possibly just my guilt trying to make itself feel better. But watching you at that fashion show, reading your professor's evaluations of your work, learning about Igbo values of perseverance and community that you embody so perfectly, I can't help it. You make me want to be better. You make me believe I can be better. Chinaza's tears fell freely now, her hand reaching up to touch his cheek with a gentleness that made Min-jae's breath catch. I'm falling for you too, she whispered. And it makes no logical sense. You're the man who destroyed me 2 months ago, who made me cry myself to sleep, who confirmed my worst fears about how the world sees black women. But you're also the man who spent 6 weeks genuinely trying to change, who defended my work publicly, who's learning my language badly but sincerely. I don't know how to reconcile those versions of you. Maybe you don't have to reconcile them, Min-jae said, covering her hand with his, marveling at the warmth of her skin, the trust implicit in her touch. Maybe you just have to decide if the person I'm becoming is worth the risk of trusting despite the person I was. Before Chinaza could respond, the ceremony coordinator called her name, announcing 5 minutes until the program began. She pulled back reluctantly, wiping her tears, gathering herself with visible effort. "Come to the ceremony," she said suddenly. "Not hiding in the back this time. Sit where I can see you. Let me watch you watching me succeed despite everything that tried to break me, including you. If we're going to try this, whatever this is, I need to know you can witness my joy without your trauma turning it into a threat." "I'll be there," Min-jae promised. "Front row if they'll let me, cheering louder than anyone. Proud of you in ways I have no right to be but can't help feeling anyway." Chinaza smiled, genuinely, warmly, with a hope that made her already beautiful face absolutely radiant. Then she turned and walked toward the ceremony hall, leaving Min-jae standing alone with his heart hammering and the terrifying, exhilarating realization that redemption might actually be possible, that love might actually be real, that the universe might actually grant second chances to people broken enough to do the hard work of healing. The ceremony was beautiful. Chinaza didn't win the top award. That went to a senior designer with more experience and industry connections. But she won the Emerging Designer Innovation Prize, and when they called her name, when she walked across that stage with tears streaming and joy radiating from every pore, Min-jae stood and applauded until his hands hurt, his own tears falling without shame or restraint. Their eyes met across the auditorium, her on stage holding her award, him in the third row standing ovation, both of them crying, both of them terrified, both of them hoping. And in that moment, Min-jae understood what his father had meant by "find something real." This was real. This pain and growth and terrifying vulnerability. This woman who demanded he be better and waited while he learned how. This possibility that love could exist not despite trauma, but because two broken people chose healing over hatred, chose growth over grief, chose each other despite every logical reason to run in opposite directions. After the ceremony, as guests mingled and congratulated nominees, Min-jae found Chinaza surrounded by well-wishers. He hung back, respecting her moment, content to witness her success from a distance. But she saw him, excused herself from conversation, and crossed the room with purpose that made his heart race. "Walk with me," she said simply, taking his hand without hesitation, leading him out of the crowded venue into Seoul's night air, into a future neither could predict but both were brave enough to try building together. They walked along the Han River in comfortable silence, hands intertwined, two people from impossible backgrounds finding unexpected harmony. Finally, Chinaza spoke. "I forgive you, Min-jae, not because you've earned it through 6 weeks of effort. Forgiveness isn't transactional. I forgive you because holding on to that pain was destroying me as surely as your prejudice was destroying you. We both deserve better than being prisoners of our worst moments." Min-jae stopped walking, turned to face her fully, and did something he hadn't done since his father's funeral. He cried without trying to hide it, without shame, with the raw vulnerability of someone finally allowing themselves to feel everything they'd been running from. "Thank you," he whispered in Igbo, clumsy pronunciation, but sincere. "Ahuru mgi and Anya. I love you." Chinaza laughed through her own tears, correcting his tones gently, then responding in Korean, "Saranghae. I love you too." They kissed under Seoul's glittering skyline. A Korean man learning to heal, a Nigerian woman learning to trust, two cultures meeting in the space between trauma and hope, between prejudice and love, between who they'd been and who they were brave enough to become together. 3 years later, Min-jae and Chinaza stood in a garden decorated with both Korean lanterns and Nigerian Ankara fabric, surrounded by families who'd traveled across continents to witness this impossible union. They'd chosen a dual ceremony, traditional Igbo Igbankur wine-carrying ritual followed by Korean paibik, honoring both heritages without diminishing either. Mrs. Park and Chinaza's mother embraced like sisters, tears of joy streaming down faces that had known too much sorrow but had chosen hope anyway. Taehyun served as best man, joking about his fearsome boss getting domesticated by love. When Chinaza carried the palm wine among guests, seeking her husband in the traditional Igbo ceremony, she passed wealthy men and powerful figures before kneeling in front of Min Jae. No longer a mafia boss, but the founder of a legitimate security consulting firm specializing in Korean-African business partnerships, offering him the cup with a smile that contained entire universes of forgiveness and trust earned through sustained effort. He drank, and the garden erupted in celebration. Their final scene was simple. A modest Seoul apartment filled with warmth, Chinaza's fashion designs hanging on walls, photos of both families smiling, Nigerian and Korean decorative touches blending beautifully. Chinaza, 8 months pregnant with twins, worked on sketches for her internationally recognized Unity fashion line. 2 years later, Min Jae sat beside her reading a Korean Igbo children's book to her belly. His pronunciation still terrible after 3 years, making her laugh that same warm laugh that had saved his soul. "Say it again," she teased, correcting his Igbo tones for the 1,000th time. He tried, failed, and they both dissolved into laughter. He rested his hand on her belly, feeling their twins kick, the next generation born from impossible love, living proof that choosing compassion over prejudice, growth over grief, love over hatred could create something beautiful enough to heal what seemed forever broken. "Ahuru mgi Anya," he whispered, finally getting the pronunciation right. "I know," Chinaza said, touching his face with infinite tenderness. "Now say it in Korean." "Saranghae," he murmured, kissing her softly. And in that moment, in that small apartment filled with 2 cultures and infinite love, Min Jae understood completely what his father's dying words had meant. This was real. This was what mattered. This was worth every wall he'd had to tear down, every prejudice he'd had to confront, every comfortable lie he'd had to abandon to become someone worthy of the extraordinary woman who demanded he be better and waited patiently while he learned how. Love didn't erase his trauma, didn't delete Chinaza's pain, didn't magically solve the complexities of cross-cultural relationships or eliminate the prejudices still thriving in the world around them. But choosing love, every single day, through difficulty and doubt and the hard work of sustained transformation, that could heal what hate had broken, that could build bridges where walls once stood, that could prove that redemption wasn't just a beautiful story people told but a lived reality for those brave enough to believe that people, despite their worst moments, despite their deepest wounds, despite every reason to give up on each other, could choose to become better, together. If this story moved you, if you believe in second chances and the power of genuine transformation, do me one final favor. Hit that subscribe button, turn on your notification bell so you never miss stories that matter, smash that like button, and share your thoughts in the comments section. Have you ever had to forgive someone who hurt you deeply? Have you ever had to earn forgiveness after being your worst self? Tell me your stories. Share this video with someone you love, someone who needs to hear that redemption is real, that love can heal what hate has broken, that transformation is possible when we're brave enough to do the uncomfortable work of becoming better. Thank you for watching this journey. Thank you for believing that people can change. Thank you for being here.